The diner was quiet that Tuesday morning, except for the occasional clink of silverware against plates. The regulars filled their usual seats, truckers with half-finished plates of eggs, retirees sipping coffee, and a few locals murmuring in low voices over the daily paper. Near the back, by the window, a man sat alone. He always sat there. His gray, tattered hat shaded his face, and his clothes were worn to the point of threadbare. There was an odd precision to him. He placed his coffee cup on the table's edge at the same angle each time, kept his shoulders squared, and avoided unnecessary movements. No one really knew who he was, but he showed up every week without fail, always early, always alone. The regulars called him Crazy Sam, a nickname that had stuck without anyone remembering its origin. The stories about him had circulated for years. Some speculated he was a drifter, living in the woods outside of town. Others were sure he had some tragic past, a family lost, a fortune squandered. He paid for his coffee in crumpled bills and coins, counting them out slowly but precisely. Behind the counter, Carla poured a fresh pot of coffee and glanced at Sam's corner table. She watched him every Tuesday, wondering what kind of life had etched those deep lines into his face. He never spoke to anyone and never caused trouble, but his presence made people uneasy. His silence was heavy, almost tangible. Across the diner, Don, the local mechanic, leaned on the counter. He liked to keep an eye on Sam, whispering theories to anyone who would listen. This morning was no different. Don watched as Sam adjusted the brim of his hat and stared into his coffee cup. The atmosphere in the diner shifted when a black SUV pulled into the gravel parking lot. It was polished to a shine, its windows tinted so dark they reflected the dull January sky. It wasn't the kind of car anyone in this town drove, and its arrival turned heads. The engine idled for a moment before the driver stepped out. He wore a sharp navy suit and moved with the kind of confidence that drew attention. His every step seemed calculated, his polished shoes barely making a sound as he approached the diner's door. Inside, the murmurs grew quieter. The man's arrival disrupted the morning's easy rhythm. He scanned the room as he entered, his gaze briefly settling on Sam before moving to the counter. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a badge, holding it up for Carla to see. The tension in the room thickened as the man spoke to her. He handed over a photograph, which she hesitated to take. She glanced at it and froze. Though the picture was of a younger man, clean-shaven and sharply dressed, there was no mistaking the face. The other patrons noticed Carla's reaction. A murmur spread through the diner, growing louder as Don craned his neck to see what was happening. When Carla gestured subtly towards Sam's corner table, it didn't go unnoticed. The suited man moved deliberately toward the back of the room. The scrape of his shoes against the floor was the only sound as he approached the table. Sam didn't look up, but there was a sudden tension in the way he sat. His shoulders stiffened, and his hand gripped the edge of the table just a little too tightly. The man in the suit spoke to him. Whatever he said, it made Sam finally raise his head. His eyes, sharp and calculating despite his age, met the agent's. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the suited man reached into his pocket and placed the same photograph on the table. The moment stretched thin as Sam's expression darkened. The quiet conversations around the room had stopped entirely, and now every pair of eyes was fixed on the scene in the corner. Carla's hands trembled slightly as she held the coffee pot. Without warning, Sam shoved the table forward. Coffee spilled, plates crashed to the floor, and the regulars gasped. Before anyone could process what was happening, Sam was on his feet, moving faster than anyone would have thought possible. The man in the suit reacted quickly, but not quickly enough. Sam had already reached the door and was sprinting across the parking lot. The agent followed, barking orders into a small radio clipped to his jacket. The diner erupted into chaos. Patrons scrambled to the windows, pressing their faces to the glass to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Outside, Sam ran toward the tree line at the edge of the lot. His boots kicked up gravel as he moved with a surprising agility, his figure growing smaller with each stride. The agent chased after him, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the uneven ground. He shouted something into his radio again before disappearing into the woods after Sam. Inside, Carla stared at the overturned table and the spilled coffee spreading across the floor. Don leaned closer to her, his voice low but brimming with excitement. The regulars speculated wildly, their theories growing more absurd with each passing second. Carla looked at the photograph still lying on the counter. The younger version of Sam stared back at her, his face so different from the one she saw each week. This man had been confident, self-assured. Someone who belonged in a boardroom or a courtroom, not in a diner tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The sound of sirens approached in the distance, the flashing lights of police cars visible through the diner windows. Carla couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had just happened was bigger than anyone there could comprehend. As the sirens grew louder, she placed the photograph face down on the counter. The diner buzzed with speculation, but she couldn't bring herself to join in. Something about the look in Sam's eyes before he bolted lingered with her. A look that wasn't fear, but resolve. Whatever Sam had been running from, it had finally caught up to him. The trees swallowed Sam almost instantly. Their bare branches stretched overhead, and the ground was thick with dead leaves, twigs, and patches of frozen mud. He moved like a man with a plan, cutting through the underbrush with quick, precise steps, his breaths visible in the cold air. Behind him, the faint crackle of radio static grew louder. The agent wasn't far. Sam didn't stop. He couldn't. His boots crunched over the uneven ground as he pushed deeper into the woods. The familiarity of the terrain worked to his advantage. For months, he'd studied this area, committing every trail, ditch, and thicket to memory. He veered left, descending into a shallow ravine where the frost-covered ground would make it harder to track his footprints. Farther back, the agent stumbled, his polished shoes slipping on a patch of ice hidden beneath the leaves. Sam could hear the man cursing under his breath, though the sound quickly faded. It didn't matter how skilled or determined the agent was. This forest was Sam's territory. Sam slowed his pace slightly as he reached a small clearing. His chest heaved, and his legs burned from the effort, but he knew better than to stop completely. Reaching into the pocket of his coat, he pulled out a folded piece of paper. He quickly glanced at it, his eyes darting over a hand-drawn map. His fingers traced a faint red X, marked near a cluster of boulders on the edge of the forest. He shoved the map back into his pocket and pressed on, keeping his movements purposeful. Every step had to count now. By the time the sirens reached the diner, Carla had already begun cleaning up the mess. The overturned table and spilled coffee felt like a distant memory compared to the chaos outside. 2 police cruisers skidded into the gravel lot, followed by another unmarked black vehicle. Officers stepped out, talking quickly among themselves before one headed toward the woods with a flashlight. Inside, the diner buzzed with speculation. The regulars pieced together what little they knew, their theories flying across the room like wildfire. Don claimed Sam had been part of some secret government project, while others insisted he was a fugitive hiding from the mob. Carla tried to tune them out as she mopped the floor, but her mind kept returning to the photograph. The man in that picture wasn't Crazy Sam. He was someone else entirely, someone who had once lived a very different life. The lines on his face, the weight in his eyes, those were things time and hardship had carved. But who had he been before? And what had led him to this diner, in this forgotten corner of Pennsylvania? She finished cleaning and tucked the mop back into its closet. The photograph still sat face down on the counter. She debated whether to pick it up again, her curiosity battling with a sense of unease. But before she could decide, the door jingled, and a second suited man entered the diner. He was older than the first, with salt and pepper hair and a serious expression. His dark overcoat was speckled with mud, and he carried himself with an air of authority that silenced the room instantly. He walked straight to the counter and began speaking to one of the officers who had followed him inside. Carla stayed back, pretending to wipe down tables, but she couldn't help glancing at them. The older man gestured toward the woods, his mouth set in a thin line. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than just an ordinary manhunt. Sam reached the cluster of boulders marked on his map just as the distant sound of voices began closing in. The boulders formed a rough semicircle, half buried in the frozen ground. He knelt beside the largest one, brushing away a layer of dirt and frost until his hand struck metal. Using his pocket knife, he pried open a small, rusted compartment hidden beneath the stone. Inside was a sealed waterproof bag. He pulled it out and opened it quickly, his fingers trembling slightly from the cold. Inside were several items: a burner phone, a set of laminated documents, and a small black notebook. He flipped through the notebook quickly, confirming that its contents were intact. Then he pocketed everything except the phone. He powered it on and waited for the screen to illuminate. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the snap of branches and crunch of leaves. Sam knew he didn't have much time. He dialed a number from memory and held the phone to his ear. It rang twice before a voice answered on the other end. Sam spoke briefly, his tone sharp and urgent. When the call ended, he crushed the phone under his boot and kicked the pieces into the underbrush. He stood, brushing his hands against his coat, and turned to face the direction he had come. The agent from the diner appeared moments later, his suit now streaked with dirt and his expression furious. He stopped when he saw Sam standing by the boulders, arms crossed and expression unreadable. More voices joined the agents as additional figures emerged from the woods. Some were police officers, their flashlights cutting through the shadows, while others were plainclothes men who carried themselves with the same sharpness as the agent. Sam didn't move as they surrounded him, their weapons drawn but not aimed. The agent stepped forward, his breath visible in the cold air. He reached into his pocket and produced a pair of handcuffs. Sam didn't resist as the agent snapped them around his wrists. The officers exchanged uneasy glances as they led Sam back toward the diner. No one spoke, but the tension was palpable. The sound of the sirens grew louder as they approached the edge of the woods, the flashing lights painting the trees in brief bursts of red and blue. Sam kept his head down, his hat shielding his face. He didn't look at the officers or the plainclothes men, and he certainly didn't look at the diner as they emerged from the trees. But Carla saw him. She watched from the window as they led him toward one of the waiting cars. She thought about the look in his eyes before he bolted, the way he had scanned the diner as if making a decision. Whatever his story was, it wasn't over. And as the car carrying Sam disappeared down the road, Carla couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't seen the last of him. The black SUV carrying Sam disappeared down the long, winding road out of town, its polished exterior glinting briefly in the weak winter sunlight before vanishing behind the trees. The small crowd that had gathered outside the diner gradually dispersed, their curiosity momentarily satisfied. Carla stood at the window for a few moments longer, unable to look away. By the time she returned to wiping down tables, the diner had settled into a strange hush. It wasn't the calm quiet of a typical morning but a tense, watchful silence. People spoke in low tones, exchanging theories about what had just unfolded. Don was already working on a new version of the story. This time, he insisted Sam was a former CIA agent turned fugitive. Carla ignored him and focused on the photograph still lying on the counter. Her fingers itched to pick it up again, but a sense of caution held her back. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with her. The men who had come for Sam weren't just local cops. They had authority, resources, and an urgency that suggested they weren't used to chasing small-town drifters. After finishing her shift, Carla slipped the photograph into her apron pocket and left the diner. The cold air bit at her cheeks as she made her way to her car, a battered old sedan she'd had since college. She slid into the driver's seat and stared at the photograph for a long moment before tucking it into the glove compartment. Hours later, Sam sat in a sterile, windowless room somewhere he couldn't identify. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse. Just a metal table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. His hands were cuffed, resting loosely on the table in front of him. A single overhead light buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow that exaggerated the lines on his face. He didn't need to ask where he was or why he was here. The man across from him, the same agent who had approached him in the diner, was studying him in silence, flipping through a thick folder. Occasionally, the agent would glance up, his expression unreadable, before returning to the papers. Sam stayed quiet. There was no point in asking questions. This wasn't a negotiation, and he doubted anything he said would change their plans. The agent finally set the folder down and leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. His gaze was steady, assessing. Whatever he saw in Sam's face, it didn't seem to surprise him. He began to speak, his tone measured and deliberate. The words were damning, a litany of accusations and connections that painted a picture Sam had tried to leave behind. The agent described events that spanned decades, high-profile operations, betrayals, and loose ends that had come back to haunt him. Sam listened without reacting, his face a mask of indifference. When the agent finished, he slid a photograph across the table. It was the same image Carla had seen in the diner. Sam glanced at it briefly before looking away. The agent continued talking, but Sam's mind had already wandered. He thought about the diner, the quiet routine he'd built for himself there. It had been far from perfect, but it had given him a sense of anonymity, a place where he could disappear into the background. Now, that life was over. The agent's voice sharpened, breaking Sam's train of thought. The words were clear and pointed. They weren't the only ones looking for you. Sam's jaw tightened imperceptibly. That was the real threat, the unspoken danger hanging over the entire conversation. The agent's organization wasn't the first to track him down, and they wouldn't be the last. Others were still out there, and they wouldn't bother with formalities like folders and interrogations. The agent leaned back in his chair, watching Sam closely. He seemed to be waiting for a response, some sign that his words had landed. But Sam gave him nothing. Carla couldn't stop thinking about Sam as she drove home. The photograph burned in her mind, its edges too sharp, its questions too loud to ignore. She wondered what kind of life he had led before coming to the diner. What had happened to the man in the picture to turn him into the quiet, guarded figure she saw every Tuesday? When she reached her small apartment, she parked the car and sat in silence for a moment, staring at the empty glove compartment where she had hidden the photograph. The temptation to look at it again was overwhelming. Finally, she pulled it out and studied it under the dim light of the street lamp outside her building. The man in the photo looked confident, self-assured. He wore a suit, his tie perfectly knotted, and his hair neatly combed. There was something familiar about his eyes, though, something that hadn't changed. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, breaking her concentration. She picked it up and saw a text from her friend Maria, who worked at the county records office. Earlier, Carla had impulsively sent Maria a message asking if she could find anything on a man named Sam Preston. The text read, "Nothing in the usual records, but I found something weird. Old file flagged as restricted. No details, just a name and date, classified under federal jurisdiction." Who was this guy? Carla stared at the message, her pulse quickening. She didn't respond. Instead, she locked the car and hurried inside, clutching the photograph tightly in her hand. Back in the interrogation room, Sam shifted slightly in his chair, testing the weight of the cuffs around his wrists. The agent across from him had grown impatient, his calm demeanor giving way to frustration. He asked another question, his tone sharper now, but Sam remained silent. The door to the room opened suddenly, and a second man entered. He was older, with silver hair, and a commanding presence that made the agent immediately stand and step aside. The older man carried a tablet in one hand and a folder in the other. He placed both items on the table in front of Sam, tapping the tablet to bring up a file. Sam's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked briefly to the screen. The older man spoke slowly, deliberately, his tone heavy with authority. He outlined the stakes, the dangers, the looming threats. Sam didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. The older man leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Whatever he said next made Sam's eyes narrow, his expression hardening. When the older man finally stood and left the room, Sam was alone again with the agent. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, until the agent finally gathered the folder and left as well. Sam leaned back in his chair, staring at the blank wall in front of him. He had known this day would come, but knowing didn't make it any easier. In the back of his mind, one thought lingered. They might have found him, but they didn't know everything. Not yet. Sam sat alone in the interrogation room, the faint hum of fluorescent lights above him filling the silence. His hands rested on the cold metal table, the cuffs still snug around his wrists. He remained motionless, his thoughts an intricate web of calculations, memories, and strategies. He had survived too long to allow a moment of weakness now. Outside the room, the two agents conferred in hushed voices. The younger one, The man who had pursued Sam from the diner looked impatient, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The older man, with the silver hair and calm authority, appeared unmoved by the urgency in his colleague's tone. He had seen this before. A man like Sam wasn't ordinary, and patience would be their most effective weapon. The older man finally re-entered the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. He carried no folder this time, no tablet, just an air of finality. He sat down opposite Sam, folding his hands neatly on the table. The tension in the room shifted as he leaned forward and began to speak. Though no one else could hear what was being said, the weight of the conversation hung in the air. Sam listened without interruption, his expression impassive. The older man spoke of choices, consequences, and the inevitability of cooperation. There were others involved, dangerous individuals who had been searching for Sam for years. They wouldn't stop, the man explained, and the government couldn't shield him forever, not without his help. For the first time since the encounter in the diner, a flicker of something crossed Sam's face. It wasn't fear, exactly, but rather a recognition of the delicate balance he found himself in. He had spent years living in the shadows, evading those who sought him. Now, he was being asked to step back into the light, to reveal what he knew in exchange for a sliver of protection. When the older man finally stopped speaking, he slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a contract, thin but dense with implications. Sam glanced at it briefly before looking away. Carla spent the evening sitting at her kitchen table, the photograph spread out in front of her. She had retrieved her laptop, determined to find something, anything, that could explain who Sam was. Her first few searches yielded little. She scrolled through images and articles, scanning for any mention of the name Samuel Preston, and anything that might connect him to the man she'd seen every Tuesday. But the results were sparse and fragmented, as if the information had been deliberately erased or buried. Frustrated but not ready to give up, Carla shifted her approach. She began searching for key phrases she remembered hearing in the diner that day, details from the agent's rushed conversations and the whispers of the regulars. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. A string of old, unrelated incidents, corporate fraud, political corruption, even a high-profile whistleblower case, seemed to point back to a mysterious figure. The descriptions varied, but a common thread ran through them. Someone who had operated on the edges of power, gathering information that could ruin careers and dismantle organizations. Carla leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The man in the diner didn't seem like the type to be tied to such high-stakes intrigue. And yet, the more she searched, the more convinced she became that Sam was connected to something far bigger than their small town. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her attention away from the screen. Another text from Maria. "Whatever you're looking for, be careful. This file wasn't easy to find. I think someone's monitoring it." Carla stared at the message, her unease growing. She had assumed her curiosity was harmless, but now she wasn't so sure. In the interrogation room, Sam finally spoke. His voice was low and measured, each word chosen carefully. Whatever he said made the older man pause, his steady composure faltering for just a moment. The conversation shifted. Sam wasn't just answering questions now. He was negotiating. His tone carried a quiet authority that demanded attention, despite his disheveled appearance. He laid out his terms with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. The older man listened intently, nodding occasionally, but saying little. The dynamic in the room had shifted again. What had started as an interrogation had become something else entirely, a meeting of equals, or perhaps adversaries, trying to find common ground. When the conversation ended, the older man stood and collected the contract from the table. He didn't say whether Sam's terms would be accepted, but there was a faint respect in his expression as he left the room. Sam leaned back in his chair, his hands still cuffed but his posture more relaxed. He knew the deal wasn't guaranteed, but he had planted the seeds. Now, it was a matter of waiting to see how they would grow. The next morning, Carla arrived at the diner to find it unusually empty. The regulars were absent, and the usual hum of conversation was replaced by an uneasy stillness. She made herself busy, wiping down counters and refilling condiment bottles, but her mind was elsewhere. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on her. and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled into something she didn't fully understand. As she worked, a car pulled into the lot. It wasn't a police cruiser or an SUV this time, just an ordinary sedan. Carla glanced out the window but couldn't see the driver clearly. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and neatly dressed, with a calm, deliberate manner that set him apart from the usual customers. He entered the diner and walked straight to the counter, where he took a seat without hesitation. Carla approached cautiously, her instincts on high alert. Before she could ask what he wanted, the man slid a small envelope across the counter. It was plain and unmarked, its contents hidden from view. He didn't say anything, but his expression left no doubt that the envelope was meant for her. Carla hesitated for a moment before picking it up. The man nodded once, then stood and left the diner without ordering a thing. She waited until he was gone before opening the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly in half. When she unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. The message was handwritten, the letters sharp and deliberate. "Stay out of it. For your own safety." Beneath the warning was a single initial, S. Carla stared at the note, her heart pounding. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over, and she was no longer just a bystander. The warning note sat on Carla's nightstand for hours as she paced the small living room of her apartment. Her thoughts spun in 1,000 directions. The neat, deliberate handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to Sam. But how had he managed to send it? Was he warning her because she had gotten too close? Or was it something more? She stared at the photograph she had taken from the diner, the confident younger man with sharp eyes and an easy smile. It didn't match the image of the quiet, weary figure who had been sitting in that corner booth for months. Somewhere in between these two faces was the truth, and Carla felt an irresistible pull to uncover it, despite the warning. Her laptop sat open on the kitchen table, the screen glowing with the search results she had pieced together over the last few hours. The fragmented records painted a picture of a man who had once been deeply embedded in powerful, dangerous circles. Sam Preston, if that was even his real name, had been an operative of some kind, someone who worked behind the scenes, pulling strings that few ever noticed. His disappearance years ago had left questions unanswered and powerful enemies searching for closure. Carla leaned forward, scrolling through a recent article about a whistleblower who had exposed corruption in a private defense firm. The whistleblower had vanished shortly after the story broke, their identity never revealed. The timeline matched Sam's disappearance almost perfectly. As the pieces began to fall into place, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, her heart pounding. When she picked up, the line crackled briefly before a voice spoke. Low, calm, and unmistakably Sam's. "You shouldn't have looked." Her stomach dropped. She couldn't tell if his tone carried anger, warning, or something else entirely. "Leave it alone," Sam continued. "You don't know what you're stepping into. They'll notice, and they won't stop until they've erased everything, including you." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Carla stared at her phone, her pulse racing. 3 hours north, in an undisclosed facility, Sam sat in a dimly lit cell. The walls were reinforced steel, and the door had no window. He sat cross-legged on the small cot, his hands resting on his knees, his expression unreadable. The older man with silver hair appeared again, unlocking the door with a heavy clang. He stepped inside, holding the contract Sam had refused to sign earlier. He didn't speak at first, instead placing the document on the small table in the corner of the room. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured but firm. He told Sam the situation was escalating. The other factions looking for him were closing in, and the agency's resources wouldn't be enough to shield him indefinitely. Cooperation was Sam's only option if he wanted any chance of survival. Sam remained silent, his eyes focused on a spot just beyond the man's shoulder. The older man waited, then sighed and stepped back. Before leaving, he made one last statement, this time sharper, a direct challenge. Whatever the words were, they seemed to stir something in Sam. As the heavy door shut behind the man, a flicker of resolve crossed Sam's face. He waited until the hallway was quiet before standing. Reaching into his boot, he pulled out a small, improvised tool, nothing more than a bent scrap of metal he'd hidden during his capture. He knelt by the door, his fingers working quickly and methodically. It took less than 2 minutes to trip the lock. The hallway was empty, but Sam moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows as he made his way toward the main corridor. He had studied the guards' patterns during the brief times he'd been escorted through the facility, and now that knowledge served him well. He passed a small control room, its glass window revealing a bank of monitors. On one of the screens, he saw the older man in conversation with another official. Sam paused, his eyes narrowing. Then he slipped inside the control room and disabled the cameras, erasing his trail before continuing toward the exit. The final checkpoint was a heavily guarded door, but Sam was ready. He had snagged a keycard from one of the guards during his initial intake, and now he slid it into the scanner. The door unlocked with a soft beep, and he stepped outside into the cold night air. Back in her apartment, Carla was startled by a knock at the door. She froze, her mind racing. It was nearly midnight, too late for visitors. She approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. To her shock, Sam stood on the other side. His hat was gone, and his face was streaked with dirt, but his eyes were sharp and alert. She opened the door, her questions spilling out before she could stop herself. How had he escaped? Why was he here? Sam stepped inside without answering, his movements quick and deliberate. He shut the door behind him and scanned the room, his posture tense. "You shouldn't have looked," he said again, his tone low but not unkind. "They'll be watching you now." Carla crossed her arms, a mix of fear and frustration boiling inside her. She demanded answers, her voice shaking as she confronted him. Sam hesitated, then relented. He told her the barest details, enough to satisfy her curiosity without revealing too much. He explained that he had once been part of a covert network, gathering intelligence that had brought down powerful players in politics, business, and organized crime. But his actions had painted a target on his back, and he'd spent the last decade running from the consequences. The men who had captured him weren't his allies, but they weren't his enemies either. They were simply another force trying to control him, to use his knowledge for their own ends. Carla listened in stunned silence as Sam outlined the stakes. He warned her to stay away, to erase everything she had found and go back to her normal life. But as he turned to leave, she stopped him. Her voice was steady now, her fear replaced by determination. She told him she couldn't unsee what she had discovered, couldn't pretend it didn't matter. Sam studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he slipped out the door and disappeared into the night. Carla stood there for a long time, the photograph still clutched in her hand. She knew her life would never be the same. Whatever storm Sam had brought into her quiet world, it wasn't over. And deep down, she knew she would see him again.